Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you on this wonderful Lord's Day. If you want to go ahead and be turning your Old Testaments to 1 Samuel chapter 17 this morning, that's where we're at. 1 Samuel chapter 17. All right, let's bow for a word of prayer before we get started this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity that you've given us to gather together as your family, to be encouraged by your words, to be uplifted by other brothers and sisters. We thank you for the promises that you've given us in your word, that you hear us today and that you are here, and that we put so much hope in that, and assurance in the things that we ask that you will answer according to your will. Ask that you be with all of our teachers this morning, their willingness and ability to teach, and just continue to lift them up and encourage them. Be with us as we do these tasks and let them glorify you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Before we get into chapter 17, I want you to go back up to chapter 16, verse 18. We have been introduced to young boy David because of Samuel. Samuel went to Jesse, and David was one of the 7 sons that was chosen to be anointed because God could see the potential in David. And we're going to hear stories later on about what he did with the bear and the lion, what he did with certain things in his life. But a character of an individual is usually seen by how other people talk about them, right? Have you ever had anybody try to lift themselves up by talking about their own characteristics? I mean, it's pretty easy to see where they're trying to toot their own horn, right? And they're trying to lift themselves up, and it doesn't go over very well. But when somebody else, even outside of the realm that they are a part of, has something good to say about an individual, that means a lot, doesn't it? That shows you that this individual is true and sincere in the way that he lives, in the way that he deals with certain things in life. And if you look at verse 18, this is witnessing of other people about young David. And it's amazing. We looked at this last week. This is one of the king's men, Saul's men that is trying to find ease for the king because of the evil spirit that the Lord brought upon him. So these are the king's men that have seen David out and about. And this is what they've witnessed. One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Is that not a glowing reference? Wouldn't you want, if you were going to try to get a job somewhere, have somebody to write a reference like this for you? Wouldn't that be a good reference? And this is nothing that David is doing out of the ordinary. This is just David's life. This is how he's living. And individuals are seeing that, and they're showing the kind of individual that he is, the young man that he is, the teenagers that probably he is. Because when we get into chapter 17, we're going to see that David's only in his teens when he meets Goliath. All right, so the last of chapter 16 last week, we saw that David did come in and he did play for Saul, and every time that David played, the evil spirit left and there was peace in Saul's life during that time when David was around. Now in chapter 17, as I said last week, there's some time difference. There's some time lapse here because we know that David was with Saul in chapter 16, But now in chapter 17, he's going to be back home with the sheep. And there's going to be another conflict with the Philistines. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sokoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sokoth and Abazekah. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Eli, and drew up in the line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and the Israelites stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp a Philistine, a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he had an arm with a coat of nail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. All right. Now I went back and I kind of translated some of these weights and measures to what we could understand. Over 9 foot tall, and some of your translations may say that. Mine says a height of 6 cubits, so that's about a little over 9 foot tall. The coat of armor, the coat of nails, would weigh about 125 pounds, and you may have some of, in your translation, some of that also. And then the spear shaft, it weighed 15 pounds. So we're talking about a heavy-duty armor, right? And we don't get the weight of a lot of the other things that was on his body. So this just shows us that Goliath, in his height, and he was armored to the tilt, wasn't he? He was covered. He was ready for battle. There was nothing going to get through that. So this is what David is going to face. This is what the Israelites are facing. This is what Saul is facing. Now, do you remember the first time that we saw Saul facing the Philistines? Remember that? Remember the description of how many Philistines were out there? You go to Galveston, you pick up the sand, and can you count the sands as they go through your finger? No. That's what they talked about. The last time that we saw them fighting, the battle was so intense that people were running and hiding in caves. They were hiding in tombs. You remember that. And then Jonathan stood up with his armor bearer, and he came to the rescue. And because of that, then Saul kind of rallied up everybody else. And that's the episode where Jonathan ate the honey, and you'll remember that. So this is the second time that the Philistine army now is against the Israelites. So the first time, Saul was able to defeat the Philistines, to drive them away. So how do you think the Philistines are feeling now in chapter 17, the second time that they're going to face Saul? We don't see Goliath the first time, do we? I wonder why we don't. Do you think he was around? Remember that the Philistine area was huge. They could have been in a different area, in a different district. But there's no doubt that the lineage of Goliath was in that area. I mean, we talk about that. We'll talk about that later, of the descendants of Goliath. So it probably got to the point now in chapter 17 where the Israelites were so well established that the Philistines decided we need to bring in all of our big guns, right? Let's call in Goliath. And at first glance, it's going to look like that he's done a good job. 9 foot tall, with all this armor, with this javelin and the sheer sight of this man. And this is what he said, verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servant and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all the Israelites heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. All right, does that make sense that a man of 9 foot... Anybody in here ever seen a 9 foot tall man? There's probably been some 9 foot tall men. Maybe, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I hate to admit this, but when I was younger, I used to watch professional wrestling. There was a big guy, Andre the Giant. I don't remember. If anybody remembers Andre the Giant, he might have been 9 foot tall. He was a scary guy. And now we're seeing this overwhelming individual with all of the garb on. And now he's bold enough to stand and make this claim. Now, why do you think that they came up with the idea, let's just do one man on each side to fight? Has there ever been a battle fought like that? Okay. They felt pretty confident. Do you think that they were aware that God was on the Israelite side since the first battle? Do you think they might have been aware of who God was maybe the first time? I think maybe they saw the power of God in what Jonathan was able to do and what Saul and all the other Israelites came and did. And now they've come up with a solution. Let's not waste our men. Let's not get into another battle because the first one didn't turn out so well. Let's make the odds in our favor. There's nobody in Israel that is as big as Goliath. So let's challenge one-on-one. Instead of the whole army of Israel, which God apparently used, let's use just one man against one man. Surely a little man against a big man, even though God is great, maybe the Philistines thought Goliath is going to be able to defeat anybody. Right? Did the Israelites buy into that? They bought into it, didn't they? They forgot about what God had done for them in the past. They had forgot about the promises. And they were shaking in their boots, weren't they? They were scared to death because of this one individual. Now, we already know the characteristics of Saul, right? Saul has already been shown his future, and it was dark. He had God had no plan for Saul to take over, so Saul was making one bad decision after another, and we've seen that. So for Saul to be scared because of this one man goes right along with what Saul usually did. Was Saul ever described, go back to verse 18 again of chapter 16. Did we ever hear Saul being described as a man of valor? No, the opposite. What about a man of war? Maybe, but not on God's standards. A man of good presence, a man that God was with. Saul didn't check any of those boxes, did he? So now that's why we see all of the children of Israel, they are afraid. And they are running. They're greatly afraid. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, look at verse 12. Now, David was the son of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons in the days of Saul. The man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul in the battle. Look at verse 14. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So, obvious, David did not go to battle because why? He wasn't old enough, right? He wasn't able enough to go and do the things that maybe other people thought he could do because of his youth. That could be a case. But it also could be a case that somebody needed to stay home with the father to take care of the sheep and the cattle, right? Has that ever happened before when people have been brought to war? They'll leave somebody at home. If all the sons are taken, they'll leave one at home. I mean, when there was a draft, they did that. So either way, not sure why he did it. Could have been because he was young. But either way, he wasn't there in battle. I don't think he didn't go to war because he was afraid. I think we can eliminate that idea, right? He wasn't afraid. But he was at home. For 40 days, the Philistines came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So, over a month, Goliath came in the morning and gave this almost ultimatum. Somebody come out and fight me. Is a month a long time? A month is a long time, especially when you don't know what's going to happen. 40 days, over a month, 40 days. And Jesse, the son of, said to David, his son, take your brother's effort of this parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commanders of these thousands. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they are all at the men of Israel were in the valley of Elam, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment at the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle against army, and David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine Goliath, by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So how many days had this challenge been going on? 40 days. So these people were aware of this. This was the first time that David had heard it. Keep in mind. First time this young man of valor, this young man where other people had saw that God had been with him. He was a man of war. He was prudent. David hears this cry for the first time. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fell from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free of Israel. All right. Now, was that a pretty good deal? You probably were a peasant or a son of a peasant if you were part of the army. And now the king is offering riches beyond your imagination. And not only riches, but now you're going to be part of the king's household, which brings so much to a man's life. Doors would open up. He would never have to worry. And also we're going to see this man that volunteers, his father's household won't have to pay taxes anymore for the rest of his life. That's a pretty sweet deal, isn't it? So you'd think people would be running to that deal, right? Is that the case? Why isn't that the case? They're scared, but what was going to happen if they took on this 9-foot man? They were going to die. So what good would any of that do? right? So they realize that. So no one comes up. And David, this is verse 26, and David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and take up the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" All right, there's our boy David, right? There's this man of valor. There's this man of honor. There's this, a young man that the first time he hears this defile of the Philistines, what's he ready to do? He says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." Now, he comes to the younger comes to the older brothers. That's verse 28. Why do you think the older brother is upset with David? Now, keep in mind, now he's an older brother, but was he there when Samuel anointed little brother David as king? He was. Do you think there was some resentment? Jealousy? Yeah. When he saw, because he'd heard that before. He was there with the other brothers. Now, he hears this and he makes a statement, the last part of 28, "And with whom have you left the few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil in your heart, for you have come down here to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him as before. When the word of David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." All right, so again, David's character. Isn't it wonderful? So, you remember when Samuel came to Jesse's house and those 6 brothers passed before Samuel, and what Samuel say as each one passed by? Nope, that's not him. Now, we already see one of the characteristics of one of the brothers. He's calling his younger brother, he says, "You're an evil young man. You've got evil in your heart. You're here because you're evil. You want to come here and just see the battle. You're evil." So did God get it right with this one to say, "No, you're not the one"? He did, didn't he? Because God can see in the man's heart. Man sees in the outward appearance, God sees in the inward appearance, right? But now look what David did. David says without a doubt, the first time he heard this challenge, he came up to Saul, which Saul should have already known him. We really don't get that. It almost looks like he's introduced him the first time, but we know that David has been with Saul, playing the harp and comforting him. So now Saul looks at David and he makes the statement, "You are not what we need. You can't do it. You're only a youth. And if I put you against Goliath, we will be their servants in the end of the day." Does that make sense? A young teenager against a 9-foot man. That's what Saul's seen. He says, there's no way. So his idea, before we read verse 34, is you're not going. You're only a young man, you can't do it. So that's his idea right now. That's Saul's idea. But David said to Saul, this is David, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of its mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lion and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. Now, again, going back, I'm using chapter 16 a lot because this characteristic is so real. Chapter 16, verse 18. He was a man of valor. We've already seen that. He was a man of war. I think we could say going against a lion and a bear. Is that a war? That would be considered a big war, right? Now, he was prudent in speech. Have we just seen that characteristic with David now? Because he was so prudent in speech, he is going to change the mind of Saul. Again, remember, Saul looks at little David and says, I don't think so. But after he makes this speech and says, if God's going to give me the strength to do it with the bear and the lion, he's going to give me, look for verse 37. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So did little David have to do some convincing? I mean, he did. Because look what was in the balance. Was there something in the balance that was going to be precious? Yeah. It was, you're going to be a servant for the Philistines, or the Philistines are going to be servants to you. And it all was based on David. Now, at first glance, Saul said, no, you can't do it. But after David stood up and gave this speech, he convinced Saul. So Saul's almost saying, okay, at the end of the day, we could be their servants, or they could be our servants. That's what he's saying to David. He's saying, it's in your hands. Okay. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I wonder if David stepped back and said, what? Wait a minute. I don't think he did that. I think from the first word out of his mouth, he was ready. He was almost excited. Was he afraid? I mean, now, fear is fear. You can have faith, but going against a 9-foot man, would there be some element of being afraid? Now, that's not a sin to be afraid. And it even makes it more special when somebody that faces their fears and overcomes them because they trust in the Lord. Now, whether his fear was totally gone or not, it doesn't matter. But he was a young man. He wasn't a superhero. He had feelings like we all did, and we know that later on because he let some of those feelings get the best of him in his life. But he faced Goliath with the understanding that God was going to be his shield. And we're going to see that in verse 38. Because now after Saul says you can do it, Saul says, okay, if you're going to go against Goliath with all of his armor, with his big spear, then you're going to have some armor too. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, Saul's still relying on what? The physical, right? He's still relying on the flesh, physical things to bring salvation. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of nail. And David strapped his sword over his armor and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Well, the story just gets richer, doesn't it? David, that was a young man that was taught about circumcision. Jesse must have been a good father, because he mentioned the word circumcision when he said these uncircumcised individuals. So he knew the old covenant. He knew God. He knew how special all that was. But for a young man to have this kind of characteristic, to be a man of valor, a man of war, a man that people could see that God was with him. Have we seen that so far? With what David has done in just these few verses, could we say God is with that young man? Has there been anything miraculous happen in David's life yet for that to happen? No. Nothing miraculous has happened. The only thing that's happened right now is that we have seen the character of David through his courage and through his words, right? And through his actions. Nothing miraculous has happened yet. So people can't say, well, God is with him because all these miraculous things are happening. It's just because of his way he's lived, how he's dealt with situations, his speech. Now, there's going to be something miraculous happening in a moment, but at this point, nothing yet. And now, David even makes a statement that, you know, I've got all this armor, and I love growing up as a young child because my Sunday school teachers did such a good job in all of the classes in showing little David with all the armor on him and trying to walk around and couldn't do it. So David says, take it off. So did David care anything about physical armor? He didn't care anything about the sword or the shield or the helmet. So what does that tell us about David? Who did he put his faith in? Who was his shield? Who was his armor? Who was his sword? Now what's so amazing about that, later on David's going to give us a song about this very same event. And we're going to see why he did what he did, how he could do what he did, because he felt this way about his Lord and his God. When his brothers were against him, when the king was against him to start off with, he still had faith to say, this uncircumcised individual that is defiling the name of God will be defeated. As I defeated the lion, as I defeated the bear, I will defeat Goliath. And Saul bought into it. He said, okay, let's go. Verse 40. And he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved toward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine stood and saw David, disdained him, and he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? That the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. All right, for 40 days, this giant had went out, given the challenge, and what did he see the Israelites do? They were shaking, right? They're running, they're hiding. So, for 40 days, he's went back to his tent, and what has been his mindset? I am great. I am so powerful. Nobody is going to stand against me. I mean, he was being built up for 40 days, wasn't he? And maybe all the Philistines were saying, yeah, keep it going. Nobody's going to stand against you. So he had that kind of mentality anyway. So when he sees this little bitty youth coming towards him, he gives the answer that his mindset is. In fact, he says, am I a dog? Meaning, he's anything but a dog. What's the opposite of a dog? In realms of importance. A dog is a dog. Dog stays outside. A dog, I mean, those of you that have dogs in the house, Greg, I'm not saying they can't live in the house. But from a dog to a human being, there's a big difference, right? And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, you're saying I'm a dog? So he thought a lot of himself. So when he saw David coming, it upset him. It made him mad. And that's why he made this statement. I will give you flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Do you think Goliath had killed before? He was a man of war. So do you think Goliath knew exactly how he was going to dismember David? There's no doubt he knew exactly. He had it planned. He had done it probably many times before. Then David said to the Philistines, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, and I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. So now we see the difference, don't we? We see the kings of the earth relied on chariots. They relied on spears. They relied on armor. They relied on physical might. And the Philistines had it. And David even makes that point here. He says, that's what you come with me at. But look what I'm coming with you with. I'm coming with you with the God of the armies of Israel. You think that meant anything to Goliath? It didn't mean anything to him at all. But it was everything to David, wasn't it? It was everything to David. And David believed it to his core, right? We know that. Some scriptures say that he walked to Goliath. Here in a minute we're going to see that some of your scriptures will say that David ran to Goliath. He ran to face Goliath. Again, there's our boy David, right? A characteristic of David, he could not have done that. He could not have said the things that he said. He could not have done the things that he had accomplished without realizing who he had on his side. Was he relying on King Saul at all? He wasn't relying on the Israelite army, was he? He was totally relying on God. So again, Samuel got it right there on that day in that house when those 6 brothers walked by and Samuel said, nope. And then when he saw David, he made the right decision. 46 again. This day the Lord will deliver you into the hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies to the host of the Philistines, this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is God in Israel. Now, this event, that it hadn't happened yet, but when it does, is this a miraculous event? Is this event that only God could make happen? Okay, so beforehand, David had not had really any miraculous events except for the bear and the lion, but I'm mainly talking about there in this instance was he was in the battle. And people made these comments about him. Verse 47, and that all the assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle of the Lord, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So was David convinced there was going to be victory? Was there any doubt in his mind there was not going to be victory? I don't think there was a doubt. He knew without a doubt. Now, did this come upon him all of a sudden? Or did he learn this faith? He learned this faith, didn't he? We already know the statement that he made in verse 34 when he told Saul what happened when he was a shepherd. And he gave all of the praise to God. He didn't go home and say, Dad, I'd been working out. I've learned to throw the spear. I learned to throw the club. And because I've worked so hard, I was able to kill the bear and save the lamb. Is that what he said? No. He didn't give any glory to himself at all. He knew the only way that he was able to have victory over anything in his life was through his God. So after he makes this statement, verse 48, then the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, and David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistines. Anybody else have any other word besides ran? I hope you don't. I like that word, don't you? Ran to this giant. Ran to the problem. Ran to the enemy. Ran to the overwhelming circumstances. When everybody else was doing the opposite, right? They were running and hiding. But David, because of his faith, because of his love, because he was a man of valor, he was a man of war, he was a man devoted to God, he was a man that people could see that the Lord was with him, and this is big evidence of this. He could run toward this mammoth of a man that had the spear, that had the garb of battle. And he could run to him with what? What did he have in his hand? A sling. So, David must have really relied on that sling, right? What do you think? David didn't care about that sling. God used that sling, but David trusted in God, right? He trusted in God to use that sling. So he ran quickly. Man, Israel's going to have a good king, right? With all these things that we've seen so far, Israel's going to have a good king. Do we see why God said, David is a man after my own heart? We're kind of getting a glimpse of that, right? And David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into the forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and took over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharan as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and put it with his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistines, he and Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son in his youth, and Abner said, "As your son lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistines, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with his head and the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Now that may confuse some individuals, just as it confused me. Did Saul not know who he told to go out and face Goliath? He did. He gave the orders for David to put on his armor. And David said, "No, I can't do it." So you think Saul saw all that? Do you think Saul saw as David went out into face Goliath? You remember what God put on Saul because he had stepped away from God? He's crazy. Remember that? The evil spirits. So do you think maybe evil spirits were happening at this moment? Confusion in Saul's life? Because we have to say, well, Saul, why are you asking who's doing that? You should know who's doing that, right? Either he was crazy from spirits or he ran back and got in his tent. And maybe he was running away from the battle. I don't know. But for some reason, he did not realize, just as he did not realize when Jonathan had defeated the Philistines for the first time. Remember that? He had to ask, who is doing this? So, Saul doesn't know what's going on. He is confused. Samuel got it right when he says, the kingdom has been taken away from you and been given to somebody else. That somebody else was David. And is David taking control of the situation? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Now, chapter 18, we're going to see a little bit more of the story about David and because of his triumph and how Saul's going to be against David because of that. All right, let's have a word of prayer. We'll be dismissed and we'll get into our service. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for all you've done for us. We love you so much, and we want to show you that by our works. We want to be men of honor and women of honor. We want to be individuals who people look at us and see you in our lives. Thank you for all you've done for us. We love you so much. In your name we pray.